Hi everyone, and thank you for coming to the channel. So today's topic is a depressing one, unfortunately, but something I feel has to be discussed, it has to be brought up because to me it's one of the no, not one of the, it's the biggest problem in this country, to my mind. And I'm not underplaying other issues, I'm not underplaying other challenges, but to my mind, the lack of public trust in the justice system is the biggest problem in this country because it's not that Britain's particularly dangerous, but when you have a system where a situation where so many people feel angry and disillusioned by a system they feel just isn't working, then that is clearly a serious problem. There are other things as transport, infrastructure problems, and I don't underestimate the issue of immigration. And for example, parts of Kent, for instance, that would be the major number one issue. But for me, I made the video recently on negative points about the UK. To me, this is pretty near the top, if not at the very top. Um, because you've two things: you've the crime itself, and you've the fear of crime. Now, like I say, in terms of the actual data, Britain isn't particularly dangerous. Our murder rate, for instance, is nowhere near countries like El Salvador, at least previously. Um, Perhaps that's changed a bit now with different policies under President Bukele. I don't know how the latest figures compare to previous figures in that country, but certainly if you compare Britain to Honduras, South Africa, numerous other countries, then we're not particularly dangerous. That just because other places have it worse isn't enough to say, well, let's be complacent. There are enough people out there who feel sickened and disillusioned by our justice system. I've just written a lengthy email to the Sentencing Council of England and Wales, basically laying out what I think about this because they are one of the bodies responsible for justice. Now, they're not alone. You get different branches of responsibility. So legislators make the laws, and as far as I know, they set the maximum and minimum tariffs for sentencing. But within that, that's the Sentencing Council. They issue the guidelines that judges then use. Judges, for their part, say that their hands are tied by the restrictions that they have. So actually, what you have is a situation, and I've long felt this way, we're sort of passing the buck, whereby each branch will say, but we're just advisory, or we can't interfere in the judiciary, or we're just following their guidelines, depending on which branch it is. I think they're all responsible. Legislators are responsible when they set minimum tariffs. The Sentencing Council is responsible when they set out guidelines that fall far below what the public expect. And judges are responsible. They may have their hands tied, but they still have a good degree of discrepancy within that. And they often make a decision that actually goes below, even when the aggravating and mitigating factors are brought in. And what I find utterly perplexing is the judge themselves will express the gravity of the case, and yet it is not reflected by the sentence they impose. Now, there's a case that got a lot of notoriety, and the sentencing was today. I may make another video about this. I'm not sure yet. It's fairly depressing. It's a high-profile case. An elderly gentleman in Leicester, Bhim Kohli, um, was murdered by a 15-year-old in a park. And a then 12-year-old girl filmed it. She's now 13. Well, they were sentenced, and this is one I was sort of anticipating. I was honestly, what I was expecting was he'll get 10 years and she'll get 5 years, something like that. He got 7 years in a young offenders institute, and she got 3 years of a rehabilitation order, not even a custodial sentence. That is a disgrace, an absolute utter disgrace, and both get to enjoy anonymity. The girls express no remorse. The boy has claimed that he knows what he done was bad and he has anger issues and he feels very scared. But I've seen no evidence based on the transcripts that he's actually expressed any sympathy or remorse to the victim's family. So when you think about it, he's 15. He'll spend 7 years in a young offenders institute. He'll be out at 22, assuming he doesn't get early release. Still be a very young person, get to enjoy the rest of his life and do what he wants. I think a just sentence, to my mind, would be for the boy, because he was the one that killed the man. I'd give him a minimum of 15 to 20 years. I'd give the girl 10 to 12 years. Some might say she didn't actually inflict any violence, but I think for someone to film a murder and laugh about it is sadistic. And when you think that she's basically a child, what sort of adult is she going to grow into? You see, this is the thing that angers me about how young offenders are addressed. The focus is on whether they're young. So, we have to protect them. We have to protect their names. We have to, but it doesn't seem to be factored in that if they're capable of doing that at that age, what's to say they won't be dangerous adults? In fact, it's very likely that they will be. This is why I advocate much tougher sentences because I'm not sure that coming out after 7 years he will change. Ironically, when the left talk about rehabilitation, there's actually, I would argue, a greater chance of rehabilitation if there's a more meaningful sentence to begin with. Because if you get a soft sentence, I mean, certainly in the case of the girl, I don't see how she's going to have any sense of introspection when she's got a pretty pathetic community order. I'm not sure what that will involve, but the point is she's avoided prison. um, I do think their parents should have been got some sort of punishment, or their custodians, or whatever the case may be. Um, it's a harrowing and awful case. The victim was described by everyone as a gentle and pleasant person everyone who knew him had good things to say about him. He also endured racist abuse leading up to this. This wasn't just a case of a moment's stupidity on the part of the killer. Um, this was an aggravated assault on an elderly man. He was 80 years old. Um, my heart really goes out to his family. I can't imagine the pain and I'm sure mental anguish that they'll be going through. Now, this is the thing that really is contemptible. There is a process that the public, any member of the public, you don't need to be directly involved in the case, can get involved in. It's called I think it's called the undue sentencing scheme. This is to say that anyone could write to the Attorney General of England and Wales to have a case reviewed as being unduly lenient. Well, good luck navigating that. I'll put a link on this video, but if you look at it, it is so complex. It, you could be forgiven for thinking it's been set up almost to be obstructionist, almost to make it impossible for the public to have any recourse. Now, I know for a fact because my old Crown Court in Wales actually sent me some of the data on this a few years back. I know for a fact that the number of referrals that actually change the outcome are minuscule. That is, even those that make it to the Court of Appeal. Court of Appeal could disregard the Attorney General. So it is very, very, very difficult for the public to have recourse on this. For example, if a large number of the public say this is far too lenient, the boy should have got a much tougher sentence, that could be referred to the Court of Appeal by the Attorney General, but the chances of actually overturning, I think, are very small. If you look at their criteria, it is so, so complex. I just think I think the intention, I do think the legal establishment is very arrogant. I think they take the attitude, we know best, we'll just pay lip service to the public, but, we'll disregard them anyway. I really do believe that's their attitude. Um, and this gets into a deep rot in the heart of the British justice system. There is a deep, deep disconnect between what the public thinks and what the situation is. Now, to be clear, I do not say that every single case is wrong. I sometimes come across cases and I see the sentence and think, yeah, that's probably about right for that particular crime. And in a small number of cases, I even say it's too harsh. And of course, we've heard of miscarriages of justice, that's awful. But there are far, far too many cases where you think, what? That's the sentence? Um, Honestly, it scares me because it isn't just an insult to the victims and the victim's family and makes it harder for them to have any sort of closure. Um, but it actually, I would argue, endangers the public. Like I say, if you put a killer behind bars for 7 years, the chances of them rehabilitating themselves in that time is slim. If they go in for 20 years, they grow older, maybe there's a greater chance that they'll actually reflect on their life and think, yeah, I should change. But this guy will come out at the age of 22, still a young man, and I can't imagine that he'll be. I mean, this isn't even like 7 years minimum. That's it, 7 years. I knew in this case they wouldn't get the same as an adult, and I'm not even saying that they should, but it should be a lot tougher than what it was. If he's old enough to stab an elderly man in cold blood, to kill him, a total stranger, uh, it's chilling. I see groups of teenage boys, and I want to be careful here. I don't want people to think I'm vilifying all young people. Not at all. There's plenty of teenagers out there who are decent citizens, and they're they're good young people. But I see groups of predominantly boys, sometimes girls, but predominantly boys. There'll be 8, 9, 10 of them in a group, and they're not necessarily being violent or breaking the law, but you just know that if you were to answer back to them, for example, if they were to smash a bottle on the ground or, do something else antisocial, if you were to say a word to them, you'd be taking a real risk of getting hospitalized. That's the reality. That is chilling. It's chilling. Now, I'm a 39-year-old man. I consider myself reasonably fit, reasonably strong, but I'm not invincible. A gang of teenagers could easily make me another statistic, and it's terrifying. And what this indicates to me is they've got no fear of justice. They've got no fear of being antisocial. They've got no fear of consequence. Um, I feel so angry, so disillusioned with the way our justice system is. I just think that it's just detached. Like I say, it's not in every single case, but the detachment is very clearly there. I mean, what recourse does the public have on a judge who's soft, who imposes a sentence that most people think is just wrong? And if judges want to say, well, our hands are tied, if that's really the case, they could do a lot more about it. They could be a lot more vocal in saying this needs to change. If they think, if they would like to impose a tougher sentence but they can't, well, then they should say so. They should be putting pressure on legislators to get tougher sentences, or the sentencing council for that matter. That's why I've got little sympathy for them when they say their hands are tied, because I think they could do a lot more than they're doing. Judges are distant figures. I mean, what recourse do you have? There's no, at least with MPs, there's a constituency address, there's an email. Now, I happen to believe anyone who's in a position of power should be accountable to the public. And I think the public should have a right to peacefully criticise them and hold them to account. In the case of politicians, people complain about politicians all the time, but at least we can vote them out of office. If you think they're doing a terrible job, you have the opportunity to not vote for them and encourage others not to vote for them. But there's no such recourse with judges. That's why I say that they're distant. Recently, there's been a thing about televising sentences. I think it's good, but it's only the sentences. It doesn't really change anything in terms of how those sentences are determined. I suppose you could argue it's good for transparency. And there's been a few other things I welcome. Victims have a greater say in parole hearings. That's good. Um, the Labour government's trying to get legislation brought in to force criminals to attend sentencing hearings, to attend sentencing, otherwise their sentence will be increased. That's good. But when you look at, for example, definitely when it comes to young offenders, violent young offenders, simply don't face proportionate justice. They don't. There's just simply not a deterrent. It's not there. If they are happy to violently attack a stranger, do you really think they're going to be scared of the community sentence? They won't be. This is what the justice establishment doesn't get. Um, I read a report about the number of violent assaults on the Scottish railway system recently going up. It's a different system; it's devolved, but the Scottish Sentencing Council is just as out of touch as their English Welsh equivalent. And I've had a bit of exchanges with them as well. They have an absurd situation whereby if an offender is under the age of 24, I believe it is, they literally don't see them as an adult because they claim that research has shown their brain isn't developed enough. Well, you can vote, drink, you can smoke, you can get married, you can start a business, you can join the armed forces. But according to the Scottish Sentencing Council, you should be treated as a minor until you're a 25-year-old man or woman. So a 23-year-old man or woman is going to be treated effectively as a minor in the Scottish justice system. That is preposterous, absolutely preposterous, um, and disgraceful. There isn't really enough adjectives I can use to describe what I feel about this. I mean, sometimes I must admit I find it hard to keep my cool with this because it's just so. I think it's avoidable, and I think it endangers the public. I have had experience of serious antisocial behaviour, to the point where my family had to move house. Um, I've been a victim of crime a few times on other areas. I had my bike stolen. I have been assaulted a few times. So I've had a bit of experience, less than some, more than others, but enough to feel very, very strongly on this subject. And again, I don't say every single case is wrong. I don't say every judge is out of touch, but I do think, I strongly believe that the legal establishment in this country needs a kick on the rear end. Frankly, I think it's complacent, arrogant, and yeah, I think it's out of touch. Um, I mean, when you look at, for instance, foreign criminals whose deportation is halted by High Court judges, you have to ask, what are they playing at? Why do they have such a contempt for the public that they cannot recognize someone who's clearly dangerous shouldn't be in this country? I think reform's going to pick up votes on areas like that. I'll say this right now, the only thing that would get me to vote reform is that they probably would be tougher on crime. Although I wasn't overly impressed by their attitude to last year's riots, because they were more keen to blame immigration than actually blame the thugs and yobs who were rioting. So I wasn't impressed by that. But when it comes to crime, there isn't really any party I totally trust. The Tories should have been the party of law and order. They completely failed in 14 years of power. Labour, I never expected great things, and they haven't delivered so far. The Lib Dems, no, don't trust them. The Greens, I definitely don't trust. The SNP has a track record of, leniency. So, yeah, Reform might be the only party that delivers, but I don't trust them in foreign policy. Like I say, though, this is such an important thing for me. I would consider giving Reform a vote, but words are cheap. Words are cheap. And there's another point to it. Politicians can promise anything. Here's the thing, if Reform actually got into power, and let's say Farage and his ministers actually tried to do something about this, for example, impose much tougher sentencing, what you would have is a situation where the sentencing council and judges would say, oh, they're interfering in the judiciary. So yeah, a part of that is legislators imposing much tougher minimum sentences, minimum tariffs to begin with. I'm going to wrap this up soon, but I just feel honestly, sometimes I have to force myself to think about something else because it's just so infuriating what we're seeing. 7 years for taking a man's life is it's not a proportionate sentence at all. 3 years of a rehabilitation order is not a proportionate sentence for callously filming that murder. It's just not. Like I say, to my mind, he should have got 15 to 20 years minimum, and she should have got 10 to 12 years minimum. Some would say filming isn't the same as it's not, but it's not harmless either. It's humiliating a vulnerable victim. It's showing a sadistic pleasure in what's happening. It's showing the mind of a dangerous individual. She may be a child, but what sort of adult is she going to grow into? If she thinks it's okay to film an elderly man being killed, I mean, that's chilling. Uh, and my concern is the pathetic sentence she was handed is she's just going to laugh at it. The boy incidentally claimed that he was scared and he was afraid and he knew what he'd done was terrible. But there was no indication, like I said, of showing any actual remorse towards the victim and his family. His fear and was entirely for his own benefit, like he's frightened of justice. But there's no indication he actually had genuine remorse. And if he doesn't, then how can he ever be properly rehabilitated? Because the thing that people left forget with rehabilitation is it doesn't work unless the offender has genuine remorse. You can't rehabilitate a remorseless criminal. You can't rehabilitate someone who doesn't recognize the gravity of what they've done. That isn't true rehabilitation. I think they like it because they don't like the idea of punishment. The liberal left have always had a strange attitude to that. They've always had a strange attitude to the idea of criminals being held to account for what they've done. And they are guilty of having this knee jerk attitude of thinking of the criminal first, despite what they may claim that is what they tend to do. That's for another video. I'm gonna round this off. I don't know what the answer is. One day, if I can afford it or I'm in a position to do it, I'd like to set up some sort of think tank or pressure group or something. Because I think that what we see is these trickling changes. I think the only way the public trust will really greatly improve is for a radical um, kick to the system. I think judges need to be much more accountable to the public. I think sentencing needs to increase in cases of violent young offenders and in cases of dangerous driving as well. Also, career criminals, evidence gathered by research or brought about by research conducted by Dr. Lawrence Newport shows that when a career criminal is jailed, on the rare occasion that they are, crime actually does reduce in that area. So there is a head on effect that it actually is workable. Um, Yet we see so many cases of an offender notching up offence after offence after offence and they're still spared jail. Presumably because the judge looks at each offence as relatively minor, but that's a trajectory. It's a trajectory to someone who's totally remorseless. Um, I don't say that we should have a brutal justice system, by the way. I don't say prison should be brutal. I don't think that would help anyone, but they shouldn't be fun. And I do want to see a situation where criminals are scared of justice instead of being complacent, which is what they are. I just think the justice establishment, legislators, the sentencing council, and judges have a hell of a lot to answer for. And I think as a whole, maybe not individuals, but as a whole, um, there's just an elitist disregard for public anger. I just don't think they really care. And they'll pay lip service. The Sentencing Council, for example, claims that they do public consultation. I've looked at that consultation. It's limited. It certainly doesn't cover every crime that people care about. It's limited. And it changes little in terms of the overall trajectory. So I'm not overly convinced by that. Sometimes the only choice we have is to distract ourselves and not think about it. But um, what happened to Mr. Kohli was in a relatively quiet area, I believe. I don't think it was a particularly rough estate or anything. It's a fear, you know. I think often it's sympathetic anger, I would call it that, whereby you feel angry kind of on behalf of others, I suppose. But it is also a fear that could happen to me. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. I don't know what I would do if I was ever in a position to do it. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a police officer, I'm certainly not a judge. But it's a it's a very pressing issue in this country. The justice establishment needs to get a reality check. It needs to stop disregarding public opinion. And with that, it needs to be more democratic. Final point I'll make. I am not calling for mob justice. I am not saying that justice should be determined solely by public opinion. I am saying that public opinion is largely disregarded. And I think that's wrong. I do think that those who make the decision should be far more accountable for them, by which I partly mean judges. They're not accountable. The only way a judge can be dismissed is for professional misconduct. But a judge who's soft, uh, they just get to continue in their job. At least in the United States, for all its faults, I am quite keen on the idea of electing judges because the principle is that if they are not, you know, issuing sentences that the public feel are justified, then they could lose their job. In the UK, judges can be complacent. They don't care about public opinion. I don't believe most of them do because they know that we have no power to hold them to account. Let me know your thoughts.